Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited for today's conversation. It's my privilege to welcome James Rosebush, founder of and CEO of Growth Strategy Inc., an international advisory firm advising major corporation, family offices, and philanthropic organizations across strategy, finance, marketing, and communications. But before founding Growth Strategy, James served in the White House under Ronald Reagan and as chief of staff to Nancy Reagan, the First Lady. So over the years, growth strategy has worked with globally recognized names, firms such as JP Morgan, Mercedes, Further Investments, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and the list goes on to deliver measurable growth and long-term strategic value to these businesses. So it's rare to meet someone whose career spans global public service at the highest level and also deep results-driven consulting across industries and continents. So, James, thank you for being here.
Esteban, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. So, let's jump in. I have a first question, which is when you left the White House and founded Growth Strategy, what was the core mission or belief that drove you to launch a consulting firm? And how do you think that initial mission still influences the firm today?
Very, very good question. Very good question. As a matter of fact, I ask myself that question all the time. Okay. So when you think I knew that I was ready after 6 years to take my next step.
Mhm.
And I thought a lot of people who work in politics either become lobbyists or they're lawyers. You see in Washington, a lot of people like that, people who come out of politics because you bring a lot with you when
Mhm.
you consider the fact that I traveled the world with President Reagan. I met with many heads of state. I negotiated with many foreign countries on his behalf, and I learned so much. And I had a very, very rewarding time. So it's sort of hard to beat that, traveling the world like that with the United States president. But I knew that the next step would not be to stay in politics, or I never had an interest in being a lobbyist or anything related to that, but I wanted to be focused on what I had been focused on prior to my going in the White House, which is really to help grow companies. And I'll go into that just with a little more detail in a minute. But I had also, thankfully, at the time that I had announced that I was leaving, I had 5 companies that came forward who wanted to hire me as a consultant or as an advisor. So that was sort of a divine message saying to me, take this path, because I
Yeah.
really thought maybe I would work and run one family office or one foundation or one company. And there weren't really any opportunities in that. So I think I was pushed toward this concept of working with and helping and advising many companies. So I had 5 contracts that came to me, and I think you mentioned the Coca-Cola company. That was one of the earliest ones as well.
Oh, yeah.
And I knew that I wanted to, after thinking about it, I knew that I wanted to name my company Growth Strategy because my father, when I was very young and I was a young entrepreneur, probably I was 10 years old and I was in the lawn mowing business. I would, you know, mow lawns for people. Like, I don't know whether you've done that, Esteban, but a lot of young kids do that. So my dad would always say to me, always name your company to state what it is you do. Now, of course, a majority of companies don't really follow that because there are a lot of brand names out there. But when you're in the advisory business or the consulting business, it's always good, I think, to say right off the bat what it is you do for a client and for business. So I thought about it and I decided to name my company Growth Strategy. Surprisingly, I wouldn't say ridiculed, but a lot of people were puzzled. Well, why do you want to name your company Growth Strategy? You should name it James Rosebush or something like that. And
Mhm.
actually, also, when I told them what Growth Strategy was and what I was going to do, they were like, well, you're going to be competing with the major management consulting firms, and they don't use the term growth strategy. Well, interestingly enough, 2 years after I launched my company and it was successful, and I'm not saying that they copied me, but you began to see big management consulting firms, and many times bigger than mine, many, many times bigger than mine, started to say and to identify themselves as helping their clients with growth strategies. I was a little bit of, I have to say, a little bit of enjoyment that I had taken this focus prior to these major, now we're talking about McKinsey and we're talking about, all these different firms that, as I say, were many, many times larger than mine. But they began to see that the world of business needed strategies on how to grow their business. And that's basically what it is what I call strategy is what I call a way of thinking, and
Mhm.
growth is a way of building. So strategy is a way of thinking, and growth is a way of building. That's why I put
I
those
like
two
that.
words together. You can't really grow without a strategy. I think it's been very exciting for me because I love strategy and I love answering and thinking about this particular question, which Ronald Reagan always did himself. And that is this: what is really going on? What is really going on? What's really going on in markets? What's really going on in finance? What's going on in healthcare? What's going on in all these different, to not necessarily follow what the media is telling you or follow what heads of other companies are telling you, but to really delve into what is really going on in these, I would say, categories of opportunities. And
Mm.
that is basically how and why I launched Growth Strategy. And that's why it has its name.
Okay, so in its name, you were ahead of the people, but even behind it, the vision that you had for it, because the name is the vision, like you mentioned, the growth and the strategy. So you were like a pioneer in that sense, because well, even if the big companies didn't copy you, maybe, but maybe they also did. So that's pretty unique. That's pretty nice. And I know that your firm works broadly. You have corporate clients now, family office, philanthropic organizations, as I mentioned. And I imagine that your background in politics and, like you said, traveling the world gave you that the experience to be able to work with such vast types of businesses. And how do you think that all of your experience and the fact that you work with different businesses across finance, marketing, communications, and more, how do you think it's a unique advantage when it comes to helping clients acquire and retain trusted relationships?
How do I find what is an advantage? What were you were saying?
Yes, because
What I had done before?
yeah,
That
the
that
experience
okay,
exactly.
sure, I got that. It was a huge advantage. Number 1, because I was coming at this already having relationships with heads of state and people in foreign
Mhm.
governments and so forth. And I'll give you an example. And it caused me to actually open an office for growth strategy in London for a time. So because I was familiar with and helped number 10 Downing Street with the creation of what we had done in the White House, which is called Private Sector Initiatives, bringing the public sector and the private sector together.
Mm.
I was spending a fair amount of time in London, and I was asked to take on a number of clients there. And I think that my working in government and politics was a big plus. So, for example, give you concrete examples. So the gentleman who was the Speaker of the House of Commons. His name was Bernard Weatherall, and he was a friend of mine. I had tremendous respect for him. Was invited to the House of Commons to on an occasional basis to see how they do their work as opposed to in the United States, which is very different and very interesting. And one day he said to me, James, he said, my family's company, which was started maybe 100 years before this or even longer, was a gentleman's clothing business on Savile Row. This is where British gentlemen had their suits tailored. And this was not an entirely new thing to me, and he said, I'd like you to take this company to the US and have a brand, Bernard Weatherall, for the US market. Well, that was a great honor for me
That's
and
really nice.
very thing. And this, I'm just sharing this as an example of what comes from having relationships around the world. And this was not a massive company, but it was very interesting to me to bring it to the United States, to create a corporation for it, to find the manufacturers for gentlemen's clothing and the outlets for it. It was tremendously enjoyment. I was very, very happy to do this and to dive right in. So I became the president of this company in the US. And
Okay.
that was fascinating. And I'll never forget the first day that I spent in the Savile Row tailoring shop of Bernard Weatherall, because my friend said to me, "Well, have you ever had a bespoke suit, suit that's made just for you?" And
It
I certainly have never had a suit that was just made for me. So when he said, "Well, the first thing is you have to start wearing these handmade clothes or tailored clothes." So I'll never forget my first day of going in there and being taken care of by these meticulous tailors who, this is the cloth you should wear. This is the color you should wear. All this, this sort of thing was brand new to me. But
was.
that's an example. Another example related to the UK was a gentleman, and this was in the early days of a lot of catalogs. Now we still get catalogs today. So retail catalogs, right? So he wanted to create a British version, you might say, of a couple of catalogs from the US. And he asked me to create this. And the idea he had, which was brilliant, was to have a catalog that featured the things that were purchased by the royal families. So these were people who had given the right to manufacturers to sell goods to Buckingham Palace, for example. So
Okay.
one of the first things I had to do was to work with the officials in Buckingham Palace to see if they would allow this. These are things that everything from food, really, to bed sheets, to all different kinds of things. And I had to get their approval, obviously, before this. So this was like a stamp of approval going out in a retail catalog. And the people who are then the companies who were making these goods benefited from it, as well as the owner of this catalog. There again, that was a really fascinating thing to do as well. And I want to stop because I don't want to bore you with my stories. There's
Oh,
one more I can
you're
tell
not
you.
bothering me. Don't
You
worry.
want me to tell you one more thing from
Yeah,
London?
absolutely.
So, fortunately, I had my very favorite client I've ever had, and that was a gentleman who was the most successful hedge fund manager in history, and he still holds that position. And he asked me to basically to take over the Western Europe business in terms of developing prospects for investors to invest in his launching of offshore funds. And we did this in France and in the UK. And there was a lot of success associated with this, largely because he was so successful. I give him all the credit. Nevertheless, my job was to create a strategy that would draw in the potential clients who would want to invest with him. And we were able to close every fund that he launched within 48 hours. And because of that, he was, I credit him with this success, but I was honored to be a part of that. And that, again, that was another in the UK and in France.
Those are amazing stories, and I imagine that together you had a lot of experience prior to those experiences, but then you gain also more experiences. So it just summed up, and I imagine that you that's why you work with high clients, high paying clients, big names, and it makes me wonder, in an age where many clients expect quick results. We're seeing that in consulting, but the real growth we know is often, but it takes time. It's not always extremely quick. How do you balance short term deliverables with long term value creation? And what do you tell clients to set expectations when they have those kinds of expectations?
I think that, Esteban, that you're asking really good questions. I think that it's almost impossible you can set goals. And I can give you an example of this. So in the United States, we had a medical device company, and obviously they wanted to grow their sales. And so there were several features to our work. And one was to create a strategy for growth. That's the first thing. But as a part of that strategy for growth, one of the most important things was to make sure that they had the right sales team. and that the right sales team had reasonable but impressive targets. And I think that was probably the most important thing that we did for them because we were able to grow. I think in the first 9 months, sales grew by 23%. So this was a small, mid-sized company, right? So it doesn't really matter what size your company is. It could be a startup, it could be a big startup, it could be a small startup. You need to know exactly what your strategy is related to the customer. Because I can tell you what happened in the story I told you about the men's clothing business. The American male, the people who are buying clothes, it didn't catch on with them. They weren't interested in as much in the fine tailoring that the British are known for. And ultimately that company, it ceased because we weren't selling enough of these customized suits. So to go back to this medical device company, you had to see that number one, that you had a targeted strategy for
Yeah.
sales. Number two, that you were going to the right buyers. Number three, that you had the right message. Number four, that you had the right salespeople. And we had to put that program in front of them. And they were a great company and a very happy team prior to my work there. But I would say that what I was doing was structuring a plan for growth. There was a whole period way before you were born that was called planning. So planning really came before strategy. So there were a lot of books written about planning, master planning, management planning. And I think that would have been, during as I mentioned, my dad, there was a lot of General Motors where he was, there was a lot of planning. There were planning teams, but the word strategy wasn't really used. So planning came first and then strategy came.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because we take well, I'm younger obviously, and we think that strategy always has been the front of business, and that's how business have always operated. When we talk, when I talk with leaders like you that have been in the industry for many years, that's exactly what they say, that it has changed a lot, and it has not always been the same, and that's very interesting to me. Yeah. And the last time we spoke, you mentioned briefly that one of your clients is the Saudian royal family and the Denmark, I think you
Yes.
mentioned. And I was wondering, how do values, purpose, or mission driven thinking play into the way growth strategy approaches client engagements, but especially for clients of those types that have a high social impact or legacy goals? Because obviously we see the Saudis trying to make a big impact in sports, and we see it with boxing, we see it with soccer. So with those kinds of clients, is it very different the way you approach it? Or yeah, what could you say about?
Well, it's an interesting time because there's much more activity between the US and the Middle East now. And it's fascinating to me. I would say the culture and the practice of business in the Middle East is almost 100% different
Mm.
than in the West, in not just in the US, but I would say, in Europe as well. So this is something that the cultural differences, and I'm not talking here about what they wear, their food, or anything like that. I'm
Yeah,
talking about how they look at business,
yeah.
and I think it stems from many generations ago, and who owned most of the businesses in Saudi, for example, who had ownership and who had control. And this was obviously a lot of the royal families, and then it developed so that corporations were established. Still, there were a lot of royal family members that were involved in this. But now you see a lot of independent businesses of all different kinds in Saudi Arabia, and a much greater interest in working with the West. And this is really good. In the case of the Denmark contract, that really had to do a great deal with, there were some philanthropic things that the royal family wanted to promote around the world. And I was asked by the US ambassador to do that, to help the royal family make, I think, broaden their impact in terms of their philanthropy. In terms of the Saudi contract, I was doing basically whatever they wanted me to do, which could be small or large, or it wasn't so much, here's something that, we want a new strategy for this, or we want a new strategy for that. But I was honored to have them as a client and to call them friends, and I enjoyed it a great deal. But it was much more on a day to day or week to week or month to month basis. James, we'd like you to do this. We'd like you to do that. And that was fine with me because it was interesting because the work I did for them was varied.
That must have been very interesting. With all those clients, all those years of experience across different industries, different businesses, what's the most surprising lesson that you have learned about what clients value the most? Something that maybe you didn't anticipate when you started out.
I think what clients appreciate the most is something that is going to improve their standing or success as a business.
Mhm.
And you get as an advisor who, and I always try to do this, there's some family offices, for example, that will come in and say, I have a number of issues, a number of problems that I really need to get solved. It could
Mm.
be disposing of real estate. It could be finding new banking relationships. It could be getting your kids into drug rehab. I've done all of that. So
Oh,
in those cases with families, they're very usually very pinpointed things that they need me to do, which I'm happy to do. In terms of philanthropy, I mean, I can give you the example that I was asked by President Bush at the time when the Challenger astronauts went down in that tragic
yeah.
accident. I was asked to go over to meet with the families and ask them what they would like to see as a memorial to
Mm.
their loved ones. And this was 10 days after the accident. It was very raw. I mean, people were crying.
Yeah.
It was, and so I needed to be both, kind of, might say, a compass and
Mm.
to help them be working in the right direction, but also to listen very closely to them and to help them heal from this tremendous tragedy and ask them a lot of questions. Well, what do you want the memorial to be known for? And they themselves said, we want to continue the mission of the
Mhm.
Challenger, which is, as you may remember, you probably weren't born then, but they had a school teacher that went up in space with them. And they were doing, a lot of things that a lot of students and a lot of kids were waiting to see. And
Mhm.
it was tragic because of that as well. They wanted to continue the mission. So what I did for them was to structure a whole new organization and worked as the president of the Challenger Memorial Foundation. And we had millions of dollars coming in. I raised $10 million from the US Congress. And we started before I left. I think I was with them for 3 years. There were 45 schools around the world that were teaching space science to
Amazing.
students based
Mm.
on the Challenger accident. That was I have these things that have just been absolutely remarkable, and I'm so grateful for that I've had these opportunities, and it's just varied. I'm sure that a lot of management consulting firms would say that how much they appreciate these because you're doing things that are completely unique. And
Mhm.
I think perhaps maybe my practice in my company is maybe a bit broader because I've
Yeah.
had these roles in family offices and also in philanthropy as well. So the opportunities that I had are just perhaps a little bit more interesting than straightforward management consulting firms have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Only by the few things that you have told me, I think nothing can compare to that.
Well, I'm so
Absolutely.
grateful. I am so grateful for all of the opportunities I've had to work with really interesting people doing interesting things. In a way, I'm there to help enable them and to focus what
Mhm.
they're attempting to do. And of course,
Absolutely.
then your your value is always measured by the success.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. It doesn't matter if it's money wise or like you mentioned more philanthropic or but if you're successful in what the client wants, obviously that's how you measure it. And Shifting a little bit the question little differently. Obviously, AI is a hot topic right now. Everybody's talking about it. Some people are already saturated by it. And I was wondering, how are you seeing AI reshape the expectations that clients have of consultants? Or do you think there is areas where AI is allowing firms like yours, maybe, to deliver deeper insights or accelerate value creations in ways that were not possible a few years?
Well, first of all, you see a big downturn in purely management consulting firms.
Yeah.
They've lost a lot of engagements, and it's very interesting for me to see that. And I think the practice of a lot of companies in calling on on help from management consulting firms, I I think that is something that will continue, but I think that there's a real challenge going on, and probably in every industry, but certainly in management consulting firms as well, because
Hmm.
there's a lot of, for example, you can use, I'll use the name of the one that I use, but Claude AI. You can ask Claude AI to create a new strategy for you and you can get very specific. Now, it bumps up about one thing that I think you and I have talked about, going back to this question: what is really going on? AI can think, it can create, but you have to be very careful and watchful to be able to answer that question, what is really going on? That could be the only misstep or the challenge of having AI do all of the things that a management consultant firm would do for you. And in addition to that, the human impact of, let's say, employee relations, finding the right people to do the work for you. If it can't be done, for example, by AI, there are things that I think on the basis of human skills are really necessary. So I think there has to be a blend. I know when I use Claude, which is sometimes several times a day and sometimes not, I find that I respect the way they are, quote unquote, speaking to me or delivering an answer. But I think at the same time, personal judgment and the wisdom of really, again, I hate to say it again, but asking that question and answering it, what is really going on, is critically important because we need inventive and creative strategies. And the question is, where do those come from? It comes a lot from individual experience and varied experience, which was the greatest gift I have had because in my career, I've had involvement with many different types of demands to grow different companies and different organizations. So growth has really been at the core of it. And but the I would say the difference of a firm like mine, just for example, working for tech or working for finance,
Hmm.
my practice has been much more varied. As a result, it's been much more interesting to me and perhaps because it's varied, more valuable to my clients as well.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something important, which is the human experience that cannot be created by AI, however you prompt it. And you're the example of that because you had a lot of experience throughout your career that helped you and your clients in return and being able to do the services that you offer and being broad, like you mentioned, being doing all sorts of mandates. And do you see AI taking even more and more place? Well, you mentioned the important question is what's going on. And if I ask you the question, what's going on with AI, I'm sure we could talk a lot about it, but what do you think is going on with AI right now? Do you think it's a bubble? Do you think it's oversaturated with companies being extremely high valued and that maybe are not offering something that is so world changing? What's going on with AI in your
Oh,
opinion?
I don't think I don't think that there's any bubble at all. I think it
Okay.
is a stampede. And I think it's here to stay. I
Hmm.
think it was inevitable. But remember that you just restated my question, but you missed one word. That is really.
Hmm.
It's not just what's going on, it's what is really going on. And really is a derivation of reality. So what in reality is going on? See what I mean?
Yeah,
It's just a
absolutely.
little bit, not to criticize you at all. I'm a big fan of yours, but I think that AI, there's no limit to AI. You know, in a certain extent, in its silo and what it can accomplish, it's massive.
It is massive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and of course, there's a tremendous amount of fear as well, because for two reasons: that AI can also be tremendously dangerous because it could lead you down the path of something erroneous, and number two, it could wipe out a whole workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some people, there's like two camps what I'm seeing right now. Some people are very optimistic in the sense that exactly it is gonna it's gonna get to a point, but not wipe out everybody, and it's never gonna replace the human. But we're already seeing some studies and some use cases of replacing a whole department in a business, for example, sales, customer support. It's in so it's only a matter of time, especially when they use AI to train AI, and it's like a a, a circle that, as you mentioned, I think it's here to stay, and it's not a bubble like maybe the internet was at first. There was a lot of
Mhm.
businesses, and there was a little bubble. But I also think that AI is going to put a lot of AI businesses out of work because we see, ChatGPT from the first time it from the first release to today what it can do using it in the background with via APIs and
Mhm.
integrating into systems. I think it's a really interesting world we live in right now with AI, and that's I'm specializing in it, and I'm always looking to the new trends and new stuff that's going on. There is so much every day. There's new things, new studies, new research, new use cases. So it's going to be very interesting. And in regards of all this constant change, one of my last questions to wrap up would be, where do you see your business going on in the next 1 to 5 years? What is next for you for growth strategy?
I think you have to be, and this is another thing that came from my dad, you have to be always ready to address what the need is, but needs change. So, for example, Amazon, who knew that we were just going to be, most of the things we buy will be delivered to us in a truck? Okay.
Nobody.
So, who knew? Okay, so going even beyond that, you have to keep thinking the next level of development. So I would say that that is true for my company as well. What is the greatest need that I can fulfill? What are the issues that people really need to be? For example, before our podcast today, I was having a conversation with a woman who owns a coaching company, and she coaches CEOs, all different kinds of people on how to communicate, because there's a real lack of human ability to communicate, and it's very dangerous and it's very expensive when companies, for example, can't communicate with their employees, they can't communicate with their shareholders, they can't communicate with the people that are buying things or are using things that the company has manufactured. And this is where the human play and interplay between people, both creating companies and managing companies, I think is really a big, big deal. And that is part of the element of both the origination and the development and the success of companies, as it kind of butts up against or has to interrelate with the customer. All of those things are going on, but somehow you have to reach the customer, whether it's groceries, whether it's cars, whether it's digital items, whatever it is, in order to make it work. I mean, this is capitalism, right? So,
Mhm,
which is the best economic practice known to mankind, to be able to elevate people out of poverty.
mhm.
And it has to work. And that means that you have to have a market for it. So even AI has to have a market. It has to have users, or it's not going to be powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Users and data. I think that's
Yeah.
another big topic, data. And I was talking with another consultant business owner about that, about the data. We are seeing, because you talked about Claude, you talked about ChatGPT, and it has its limitations because the context, it doesn't know your context, and you have always specify your context, the situation, and be good at it also because it makes a huge difference. But what we're seeing right now is a lot of private companies are developing their own chat GPTs or Claude with their data, with
They are.
um,
They are.
their data from 15, 20 years, everything. With building that, then they create a powerful tool that knows exactly who they are, what is their customer, are the problems. It can create new strategies, as you mentioned, in a creative way, but while keeping their values and the core of the business. So that's very interesting. And I think more businesses are going to get into that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And but but data is important, and I think, as I mentioned, a lot of AI companies are going to put some other AI companies out of service. And I've seen it here. Consulting. That's why I chose consulting a little bit more, because the human component. I'm not only providing the tool, but I'm trying to, right. I'm trying to be the one who teaches how to use the tool. Even if I sell you tomorrow an F1 car or a Rolls Royce, but maybe you, because maybe you have driven a Rolls Royce before, but the majority of people haven't. So even if I give it to you, you don't. There's so many options, so many stuff going on that you're not gonna be able to drive it correctly. So
Well, when you get one, I want to go for a ride.
yeah, okay, yeah, I'll drive it up to. I'll do a road trip and I'll go get you.
Yeah, let's
And
have a road trip.
yeah, I imagined you've had road trips in your life before.
Road trips? I love road trips. Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, well, listen, James, thank you very much for sharing all of these insights. It was incredibly valuable. I really appreciate your time and openness, and I hope the audience also appreciated everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it. You asked excellent questions.
Thank you.